One thing, just to zoom out for a little bit, the fintech tech space in general is just obviously undergoing. I mean, there's more competition than ever, but that also inherently means that there's more just interesting players doing really interesting things in the space. Everyone from like Apex and larger, more established players to, Plaid, even just Visa starting to, use stable coins and experiment with kind of having cryptocurrencies processed on their platform. So I'm curious, you're in the space much more than I am. What do you think is really interesting, either from a trend perspective or where things are headed, or just players in the space that you think are doing interesting things? Just any general observations.
I mean, I think it's probably, if not one the fastest growing area in tech for a really good reason. It's, one of the largest sectors in the global economy. It has certainly had some degree of disruption, but relative to the size of the market, not that much. If you think about the size of Stripe and their market cap and TAM versus like the percentage of processing that they're actually doing versus companies like WorldPay, for example, I really feel like we're just getting started. And I think that the investor community is waking up to this and is understanding this, I think, pretty clearly right now. I think when we started this business in 2018, there were a lot of question marks. There were a lot of question marks around, why would people use a digital bank? Aren't people just happy with what exists today? And won't the big banks just, they spend Chase spends tens of billions of dollars on technology. Won't they just like build a better product? Won't they just fix this? And I think that, in a lot of ways, people were forgetting like the lessons of, of technology just in general, which is that big companies move slow. There's an innovator's dilemma, and outside perspective is generally the fastest way to innovate. I think it's really exciting. It's a really exciting time for everybody in fintech. And we're, one small part of that. I think the world is waking up to the fact that, the traditional financial institutions that have dominated over the past 50 years are no longer invincible. And there's a better way for consumers and for businesses to basically manage their money, move their money, and accept payments.
Yeah, it's kind of, embarrassing, but I think even just as you were saying, just getting started and, making that comment that, yeah, we've seen a lot of players in the space, we've seen a lot of funding in the space, but disruption of incumbents is kind of non-existent. I mean, you even look at like the brokerage space of Robinhood and Public and eToro and some of those, and has that toppled any large player? Absolutely not. Are they still growing accounts? Are they still growing assets under management? Yes. I think that's a really interesting perspective because I think that's non-consensus and kind of a narrative violation in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I mean, not only that, like the pie is also growing. The economy is growing. The amount of money in the economy is growing. The amount of businesses that exist are growing. So it's not totally just about disruption. It's also about just growing the ecosystem overall. In the investment space, more people are investing than ever. Again, like that coupled with the fact that you've had, slow growth and slow innovation from legacy players just creates a massive opening for companies like us and a lot of people across verticals, whether you're in the brokerage space or in the consumer space or in the payment processing space, to build phenomenal products that really serve those end markets. And so, yeah, I really do believe like we're in a very early phase. This is, in my opinion, the most exciting space in tech, and even though I think, you can kind of think of fintech as kind of really getting started in like 2010 with like all the lending companies, it's much more comprehensive now. It's much more interesting because as opposed to just slapping a UI on a legacy process, founders are really like reinventing the way that finance works overall for companies. And it's really exciting from DeFi and crypto, like at the frontier of it, companies like us and to more established companies like Chime. I think there's just a wholesale change in attitude and in opportunity. And I think the consumer and the end user and the businesses have finally woken up to the fact that there are better alternatives out there. And I think that wasn't clear to them before. And now that they understand that, it's sort of like when Airbnb emerged versus hotels. And at first people were comparing the two and they were saying, Airbnb is a little bit cheaper than a hotel, so I'm going to stay at an Airbnb. And you fast forward 5 or 7 years and it's now, well, I'm going to stay at Airbnb because it's better than a hotel because I prefer to stay at a home. It's bigger, it's nicer. Even if it's twice the price, I don't care. And I think that's what's happening here. Whereas you started out with, okay, like digital products are, just cheaper. And now it's like, not only are they cheaper or at least just cost competitive, they're fundamentally better. And that is what, expands the market 10x.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally, mentally better across multiple different axes, I think is what's always really interesting. And just one other thing, just to kind of build off what you were saying, to me, there's a really interesting progression that happens, and even talking about fintech, maybe that disruption, and I'm sure this is not accurate, and maybe someone could pinpoint this more accurately, but you threw out that number of 2010, and let's take that as a starting point. And if we think about the industry, it almost feels like the first wave of disruption is people focusing on really narrow niches, and developing all this kind of underlying layer of technologies and these kind of small pieces. And then what I always enjoy is, and what I think is kind of the master move, because it's you're kind of executing at more of a meta level, is then you tie all those things together and you can deliver a value proposition that is fundamentally different than what people can get. And I think Rhos is such an amazing example of that, and kind of pulling those individual technologies and points of view together and delivering something that's totally different and is truly 10x better.
That is what we're trying to do. Like, I think you think about a lot of these pieces are, first of all, like redundant, redundant from like at least a core perspective. And so putting them together is not necessarily building 5 different products, right? It is, 5 sort of parts of a product with similar sort of internal components. And the second thing is I think that there was a really strong focus at the beginning of fintech in terms of building, very verticalized, very narrow solutions. And there's a lot of companies that are doing that today as well. Some of which are doing really well. I think that we have a different approach to that and a different perspective on that, which is that there is similarity across finance teams in terms of how they operate, regardless of industry that they're in, and they experience the same problems. And frankly, these are hard problems to solve. Being great in this space is really difficult, and there won't be a lot of companies that are great at it. So we actually I think disagree with part of the sort of popular consensus that, there will be banking and sort of payments and stuff like that for, architects and for plumbers and for software companies and for e-commerce companies, because we fundamentally think it's just hard to be really good at it. And we think the best product is what's actually just going to win across the board, regardless of vertical.
I'd add a +1 in your column. Definitely, I think that's the more realistic approach to kind of how that plays out well. And that also goes, I think one quote that always bubbles up in my mind is when you think about those kind of people competing in these small little areas, is ultimately, the player with the biggest scale, the player with the biggest network is almost always going to win, because they can deliver things at lower cost. They can deliver a better product experience. And even just thinking about that, like, what is the difference if I'm a plumber that wants a bank? I still have money needs that are basically the same as almost anybody else. It's kind of comical.
That's right. We don't think it's as differentiated as people think. Again, we think quality is what ultimately wins.